Good afternoon, everybody. This is another episode of United States history videos coming to you from the Grace Christian Academy YouTube website. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4 of your U.S. history book, Chapter 4, which discusses religion in the English colonies. Now, you may be wondering what happened to Chapter 3, and the answer is simple. I decided to skip. Okay, I'm back. The answer is that I skipped Chapter 3 because we don't have a lot of time in this course, and honestly, I thought Chapter 3 was kind of silly. So we skipped over it. Read it if you want to. It's about what everyday life in the colonies was supposedly like. Chapter 4 is about religion, and religion has had a powerful influence on the history of the United States, and we're going to talk about it a little bit. So these are some of the high points of things that you need to know coming with regard to Chapter 4. First of all, you need to know what an established religion is. Now, that's important because our Constitution forbids the national government from passing a law regarding the establishment of religion. So it's important to know what that means. And what that meant to them was this. Congress could not pass a law that said X or Y or Z church is the official church of this country, and everybody's taxes will go to support that church, and the government will pay the ministers and preachers of that church, and as a side aspect of that, the government will tell those preachers what to preach, and everybody has to attend that church. And that's what an established religion is. And that was the normal state of affairs everywhere in Western Europe up until after the time Columbus discovered America. In all of those countries, there was really just one tolerated religion, and that was what we now call the Roman Catholic religion. They just considered it Christianity. And that was it. And you paid taxes to the church, and the church did what it did, and that was it. With Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1519 and various things that happened thereafter, that began to change a little bit, but you have to understand that neither Martin Luther nor most of the people who came after him ever had any desire or interest in there not being an established religion. They wanted their religion to be the one that was established. But they all assumed that the king would support and be a member of and force everybody else to fall in line with some religion. Now, the situation in the colonies was, of course, heavily influenced by the situation in England. And Henry VIII, we're going to go back to him, Henry VIII, who was the king in the early part of the 1500s, was a very, very vocal and forceful opponent of Martin Luther and of the Reformation. He was completely against it. He wrote pamphlets about why it was bad and about why you ought to support the Catholic Church. And he was awarded kind of like a medal and the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope because he was so vocal in opposing the Reformation. He was a major league Catholic. He was married to a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon, whose brother happened to be the king of Spain. But he had a problem, and that was he wanted to get rid of Catherine. And the Roman Catholic religion generally does not permit divorces. But he wanted to be rid of her. And the reason he said he wanted to be rid of her was because she couldn't produce a son to take over for him as king. She had a daughter, a woman named Mary. Henry and she had a daughter, a young woman named Mary. But Henry wanted a son. And he wanted a son to be king of England after him. And he decided he wasn't going to get that from Catherine, so he wanted to get rid of her. But he did not want really to divorce her. That wasn't the plan. What your history book tells you he wanted a divorce, and that is the common thing, but that's not what he wanted. He wanted what is called an annulment. And an annulment means that he would get a declaration from the Roman Catholic Church declaring that his marriage to Catherine had never been a lawful marriage recognized by the Church, that they had just been living in sin and engaging in an illicit sexual relationship, which would have rendered Catherine, now Catherine was a woman known for her strong religious sentiments, but he was going to make her out to be an immoral woman, and his daughter Mary out to be illegitimate, which meant that she could not inherit any property from him and would be to some extent a social outcast. As you can imagine, that created quite a bit of resentment in some places, including with Catherine's brother, the King of Spain, who was also the king of certain parts of Italy, and who also happened to have a pretty strong army camped out near Rome. So the Pope wasn't going to give Henry his annulment. Ultimately, Henry said, "That's fine, you're not the Pope over me anymore," and declared himself the head of the church in England, which he started calling the Church of England, and then gave he had a man who he had appointed to be Archbishop give him his annulment, and he sent Catherine packing and Mary with, again, as you can imagine, some very bad feelings, and married a woman named Anne Boleyn, and later on he got mad at her and had her executed, and he ran through a string of women. He did eventually get a son, but he was a sickly kid who barely outlived Henry. But in the process of that, he established what he called the Church of England, as the established church in England. And the setup was basically that they were Catholic without the Pope. And that was what they wanted to be. To a guy going to his local parish church, it didn't look like much had changed. But some other things happened that we can't get into. If this were a British history, we would, but we won't here. But that created what he called the Church of England, what is today in the United States known as the Episcopalian Church or the Episcopal Church. And that's where it came from. It came from Henry's desire to get rid of his wife and his kid. But it became the established church. And you paid taxes to it, and you were supposed to go. Now, by that, what the law was that you had to go twice a year. And if you didn't go to church twice a year, the established church, then they could come get you and question you and give you a hard time. And you might lose some privileges and some rights because you were not part of the established church. Well, the first English settlers to come to America carried that with them. And Jamestown in Virginia was the first colony, and they established the Church of England as their official religion. But there was trouble in England because although Henry and his sons and his daughters were not particularly enthused about the Reformation, other people were. And they wanted to adopt some of these religious reforms in the Church of England. And that what they said they wanted to do was they wanted to purify the church. And they acquired the name Puritans. Well, that created a great deal of controversy, and to a very great extent, depending on who was in charge, those people ran into some problems, and they had some trouble. So when it became possible to come settle in a new part of North America, some of those people thought it was a good idea. And they signed up with the Massachusetts Bay Company to come and live in what is now Massachusetts, New England. And they came together. They came as entire congregations. You have been assigned a reading, which was a sermon called a model of Christian charity. That was preached by one of their preachers, a man named John Winthrop, most likely while they were aboard ship, where he was preaching to them about the church and the community they were going to organize when they got where they were going. And there was not going to be any distinction. The church and the community were one and the same. So there was no, we talk about today's separation of church and state. There was no idea of that. Everybody was going to be a member of the church, and and everybody was going to follow the rules, and it was just going to be that way. And those were the communities that they established first in Massachusetts, and then later on when some of them moved on to Connecticut, then in Connecticut. That was what they set up. Those churches, one of the reforms they wanted was to do away with having bishops and archbishops and people like that, and each congregation was going to govern itself, and they were called congregational churches. And in Massachusetts and Connecticut, those became the established churches, and you paid taxes to the church, and your tax dollars went to pay the preacher. And you were supposed to go to church, and if you didn't, you were in legal hot water. And that's the way it was. In the more southern colonies, in the Carolinas and Georgia, they all adopted Anglicanism, the Church of England, as their official church. Most of the New England colonies adopted the Congregational Church as their official church that you had to be part of. An exception to that was Rhode Island. Now, Rhode Island was established by a guy named Roger Williams, who was living in Massachusetts. He was a Baptist. And what mainly distinguished Baptists from Congregationalists was that they believed that only an adult who confessed belief in Jesus Christ should be baptized. You couldn't baptize babies, it didn't count. But he also believed that an established church supported by the government would always be corrupt and could not be purified. And he told people that. Well, that made him unwelcome in Massachusetts, so they chased him out. He ran away, bought a small tract of land from some Indians and established the colony of Rhode Island, which eventually achieved a charter, and that's where Rhode Island came from. It had no established church because Roger Williams didn't think they should. Maryland and Pennsylvania did not have established churches for the same reason, but the other colonies all did. Now, in New England, the Puritans ran into a real problem because they believed strongly that the church was supposed to be composed of people who had had a personal religious experience and been converted. And as you can imagine, anyone that would get on the ocean, get on a boat and sail across the ocean to a new place, they had some pretty strong feelings about it, and they were pretty enthusiastic about their religion. But they had a hard time passing that on, and churches do still have a hard time passing that on from parent to child to grandchild. But because of their structure, that was a problem, because if their kids or their grandchildren were not able to express satisfactorily the religious enthusiasm that they expected, then that didn't just mean they didn't come to church. It meant they were excluded as citizens. And that created a problem, and they tried various ways to solve it, including basically loosening up on just who they'd let be a member of their church. But that, surprisingly, did not solve their problem. It made it worse because their churches became very lukewarm. And by the early 1700s, those churches were very worldly, very lukewarm in what they taught. And the same thing was happening in the southern colonies with the Anglican or Church of England. There were a few groups who came that were not part of those groups. There were Baptists scattered throughout most of the colonies. There were Lutherans, especially in Delaware and in what is now New York and New Jersey. There were quite a few Lutherans. In Pennsylvania, there were people who were loosely called Anabaptists. And they were, today you might know of them as like the Amish and Mennonites, who kind of wanted to live separately and do their own thing, and they were allowed to do that in Pennsylvania. In Maryland, originally there was religious toleration, and there were a fair number of Roman Catholics who had a lot of trouble in England. Catholics were not tolerated in England because the Catholic Church was opposed to the whole who was king and queen, because they thought that Mary was Henry's legitimate daughter and should have been queen. And so Catholics weren't tolerated. They had some freedom in Maryland, but after about 1700, the British government started to crack down on that and restricted their freedom, including their ability to take part in certain businesses. So that's what you have. The other thing you need to read about is the Great Awakening, which was an important religious revival that started in about the 1720s. It ran a long time, but was at its peak in the 1740s and 1750s, where there was a real uptick in religious enthusiasm around the country. Two names you need to remember with that are Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, he was a congregational preacher. I have assigned for you to read, and it's in your reading list that I gave you before school, a sermon he wrote called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Now, the elder Mr. Vaughn has already read that, but he should read it again, and so should all of you, to get a feel for what was going on. So remember the name Jonathan Edwards, and remember the name George Whitefield, who was an English preacher, but who made a number of trips to America and made preaching tours, and he was very prominent. So read those things. That's about it. Enjoy your weekend, and there will be a quiz coming on this material sometime in the near future. Quizzes will be over what is in your textbook and what I talk about in these videos. So consult your notes and be aware of that, because I do want you to know some of this material. And read your textbook, because I'm going to quiz you over it. Have a good weekend. I'll see you on Tuesday.